Okay. Hey, folks, Dustin Siggins with Proven Media Solutions. Sorry for being almost 25 minutes late. I'm on a family trip, and being on that trip just meant that I was a little less prepared than I would have liked, like chargers and things like that. So, Christopher, James, Lisa, thanks for your patience. And again, my apologies for running late. Um, so today we're going to talk about preparing the C-suite for crises. And we don't just mean in the moment, make sure they don't say stupid things. But Christopher was in law enforcement. James has worked in criminal justice. Lisa's been across the public affairs and branding spaces. And what we're going to talk about is how the comms people could see around corners and how to show the CEO and the rest of the C-suite that they need to listen to us. So if you all take 30 seconds to introduce yourselves, and then what we'll do is we'll start with Christopher and the crisis 3-day seminar he and his company are hosting next month, rather.
Hi, everyone. My name is Christopher Mannino. I am Vice President at Julie Parker Communications. In my prior life, I had a law enforcement career in the Chicago area, 25 years in law enforcement. I retired as a chief of police. And one of the things I really focused on was leadership, and especially where communications intersects with leadership. So I had a really communications focused outlook, both internally with my team and externally with the community we served and with our partners. And that kind of led to my post-law enforcement career, doing what I do now, which is helping government leaders, law enforcement leaders, higher education leaders communicate before a crisis, during a crisis, and after. And right now, we're partnered with the University of Virginia, specifically with their Department of Public Safety and Justice. We're holding a conference next month at UVA. And basically, it's a 3-day crisis simulation experience where people will come, they'll receive crisis communications training, but more than that, we'll have an evolving crisis event taking place over that 3 days. So it's not just classroom, they'll be immersed in an actual fictional scenario, working through messaging, all the communications challenges, misinformation, and things like that. So we're really excited to be presenting that next month.
And James, go ahead.
Hi, I'm James Davis, the founder of Touchdown Strategies. I started my career off in the Pentagon, working crisis communications during Iraq, Afghanistan, Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, all the things that you remember from those times. And so I sort of cut my chops in that space, but then went into the political space where I've worked several Republican conventions, which can bring crisis of their own, including hurricanes, both in Minnesota. We were interrupted by a hurricane, as well as in Tampa when I ran the convention in Tampa. And then also have worked to help guide corporate leaders, CEOs, C-suites through major transitions and crisis as well, due to a lot of litigation communication. So it spanned everything from the political world to government to nonprofits and beyond.
Lisa?
Thanks so much for having me, and it's great to be part of this esteemed group. I started my career in New Jersey as a staff person for the governor there. The governor that I worked for at the time was in power when 9/11 happened. And so as a communications person, I lived a very early part of my career communicating and helping folks understand sort of all of the contours of most probably in our lifetime, one of the most public crises that could have occurred. Beyond that, I spend a lot of time. I am the founder of Friday Reporter Public Affairs, and I host two podcasts that are related to communications and reputation building. And so I think a big part about the way that I look at crisis is not just about preparation in advance, which I know both of my colleagues here will also talk quite a bit about, but also the importance of a durable reputation as it relates to enduring a crisis and being ready for a crisis long before it hits.
So let's dive into that real quick, Lisa, because one thing that, of course, Christopher and James are well aware of is that police officers, law enforcement more general in the last 10 to 15 years, you really have to show your community. It seems like, for me, as the outside person looking at it as a political journalist and a blogger, and at my prior life, it seemed like there was a lot of distrust and a lot of on the public side, or a lot of concern, but also I think they called it the Ferguson effect, where there were fewer people wanting to be police officers. So, Lisa, can you speak to the kind of preparation that needs to happen when you're in the public eye all the time? Then Christopher and James, if you can speak to being more on the ground, specifically within law enforcement. It'd be a great way to kick things off.
Sure. I think that the thing that I've been counseling more and more is that all of us really live very public lives, regardless of the positions that we have, regardless of the work that we do. We spend a lot of our time online, even sitting here today in front of a camera. This is a live shot. We are doing a live hit. And so I think more than ever before, we need to think very closely and very carefully about who it is we are, how it is we want to convey who we are outside of the world, and how it is that we communicate that to others. And that is in your own social media presence. Law enforcement probably does not have a great deal of social media presence, but their presence is felt every single day in the rooms that they walk into. So taking a sharp and thoughtful consideration into how it is you want to present yourself every day, who it is you are, is really very important, which is really sort of comes down to that component that we all are really chasing right now more than ever before, and that's that authenticity piece. How do we carefully curate who we are and tell people in a thoughtful way who we want to be and the issues that we stand for, whether or not they're issues about safety or issues about the brand that we represent or who it is we are as a person. A lot of times now more than ever, the brand is not necessarily the company that you work for. The brand is who you are, whether you're the CEO or the chief communications person. All of those things really come into play. And so that I think is a very big piece of it. Getting to know yourself and who you want to be portrayed as, or how you want to hold yourself up in public, is very important as you enter into any discussion about crises long before they hit.
Yeah, one of the challenges we face in law enforcement and American policing is there are about 18,000 different law enforcement agencies. And you have a wide range from very professional, very modern police departments to those that are not professional, that don't have the training and the skills. And the problem is that one agency having a PR crisis could be a crisis for all of law enforcement. Something that happens in Ferguson or Minneapolis can affect or impact an entire profession. And there's very few other professions where that takes place. If a brand has a PR crisis, it's a crisis for that brand. But in law enforcement, when we have an incident that goes viral nationally, it impacts all of law enforcement. And that support kind of ebbs and flows. You have, post 9/11, law enforcement was held in high regard. And then you have incidents like Ferguson, Minneapolis, Memphis, a bunch of others, where it tends to be lower. And then during COVID, it rose again. And so it ebbs and flows. And what we really encourage law enforcement agencies to do is focus on what you can control. And just like every negative story impacts the profession, when we have those good news stories that go viral, that impacts the profession as well. So what we should really try and do is have agencies get really adept at telling their story, sharing their good news, and trying to just improve that perception of what law enforcement entails, what we're actually doing on a day-to-day basis. The negative things, the poor policing, it happens. It's a part of policing, and it needs to get fixed, it needs to be changed. But the reality is there's a lot of good being done every day too. And the profession needs to get better at sharing those stories as well.
Yeah, I mean, picking up both off what Lisa said and Christopher said here is, I see public relations as human relations. And so how you show up daily with in a relationship with someone and building that over time, right? That credibility over time as a good actor helps to buttress you from if you do something wrong. It doesn't mean there won't be any accountability, but it means that I see a little bit more of you and I'm a little bit more trusting. I'm a little bit more forgiving, right? And so a lot of organizations wind up only hiring PR agencies to come in and help them when there is a crisis, and they haven't no relationships on the front end. They don't have stakeholder relationships that are important in the community, and they don't have media relationships. At the core of that word, media relations, is what? Relations. And so how do we, over time, build that up so that if something does go wrong, right? Like I've known Lisa for 20 years. So if Lisa hears something about me that she thinks is not, not great, like I offend her in some way by an action, she's more likely to give me a benefit of a doubt. And even if she doesn't give me the benefit of the doubt in that moment, when I go back and say, hey, I'm sorry, she will take that more likely than not. That's the role law enforcement faces in their communities, because they're in these communities day to day. And so how you show up day to day is going to give you that bank of credibility. And you don't want to erode that bank of credibility on a national scale. And this is what I think we've seen on the national scale, is that you might have law enforcement in a community like Ferguson. You might have law enforcement in a community like Flint, Michigan, where Chris Swanson was the police or the sheriff there, where they've done the work to build credibility in that community, but because of social media, they get a national audience, and then they get national detractors that come in and create a bigger problem in that area. So it's a tough job for law enforcement, being on the front lines, just like it is in the military and many other places like that where first responders are necessary.
Well, and when we think about that, or it's also part of that prep, right? You want to do, it sounds like it's just do good things, right? Do good things, do it the right way, treat people well, because that will build that bank of trust. Doesn't matter how many press releases or press conferences that you do. So, Christopher, when it comes to what you're going to teach, next month, how much of that focuses, and I want all of you to respond to this, how much of that focuses around doing just good work as the foundation so that the PR team or whoever you have, external or internal, can funnel that out to employees, to potential employees, to referral partners, colleges, and all the way around all stakeholders?
Next month's conference is going to be very focused on working through the actual crisis. So there will be little emphasis on the pre-crisis work. But, just to reiterate what James said, it is vital that that's being done. And not just that good work is being done, that you're treating people well, but that you're talking about it, that you're telling that story. Oftentimes, I take it back to my police department. I don't know that we were policing any better than the communities around me. But what we were doing better was talking about the way we were policing. And because of that, we had a very good reputation. We did not struggle for recruiting in the same way some of the other agencies did. And like you alluded to, when incidents would happen, we would get the benefit of the doubt. We would have people in our comments who would, on social media posts, someone would come in from outside of our community, leave a negative comment, and our own residents would come in and support us because we had built that up over time. So you're right. It is absolutely the foundation of crisis communications. I think Lisa alluded to that as well. You can call in someone to help you in a crisis, and they'll do their best, but it will not make up for not having built a relationship ahead of time. It is the single most important thing any organization can do, is build those relationships, tell your story, have people trust you, and then when the crisis comes, finesse the messaging.
The best teams to respond in a crisis are the teams that were good before the crisis, right? The communications teams that were good before the crisis, the organization that was good before the crisis, at building those relationships and communicating.
So Lisa, how do you help the C-suite prepare for a crisis by communicating the good work they're already doing? Let's assume our baseline here is we're not going to work for people we know are bad actors. Right? Let's just have that over baseline. Mm-hmm. We're not going to work for FTX, and we know that they're FTX. How do you help them realize?
I think a big way to guard against, or at least be ready, is to start to really think now about establishing your owned channels, like the ways that you talk about what you do. And it's not just about it. Yes, it's always great to have a good relationship with reporters. That has become increasingly difficult because the demand on them has become so incredibly high. And so I think it's really important as leaders, C-suite, to begin to think about how you talk about your own issues, whether it's through your own online columns, whether it's through the way you position yourself on social media, whether it's the way that you talk in your meetings and otherwise, talking about making sure that you have a consistent and concise set of principles that you stand by every single day. And knowing what those are. Those, I think, give you a nice way to sort of keep yourself moored and grounded in something that is what you believe in, and talking to them and talking about them in a very regular way, so that when crisis does hit and those challenges come, it's a nice way for people to fall back on. What James said earlier is precisely something that I talk about it all the time. It's about reminding people who you are. When you are true to who you are, even if you do have a blemish, even if a crisis does come up, you have established long before who it is you are, how you, whether it's you as the CEO or you as the company, position yourself, and being true to whatever it is that's happened. If a crisis hits, own it. There's no time to waste. It's time to own it. It's time to talk about what happened. And by the way, bring it back to the principles. We've said for 20 years, we've said for 20 weeks, we said for 20 days, we stand by these principles. That's increasingly important to make sure that you're managing your own owned channels, in addition to talking to media, in addition to your socials, all of that. But making sure that you have a consistent and steady drumbeat of messages that are established and put in place now. Don't wait for the crisis to hit. It just helps with that consistency to make sure that when you do have something that comes up, people can say, okay, they've had a blip on the screen. We're going to give them the benefit of the doubt. They've always been very clear about who they are. That I think is very important. So having a C-suite that's concise, that's consistent, and has a set of principles that they can operate against, I think is a very good way to start.
One of the things that Dave Trousnak, who's a guy in the healthcare space, taught me last year was I was trying to think, how do you convince a CEO or member of the C-suite that they should invest in pre-crisis training, that whole crisis prep that we're talking about. And the analogy he helped me understand was insurance. This is brand insurance. You always have savings in the bank. You always have the backup system for your IT. Crisis prep, building that initial trust, being ready for when things actually happen is your investment in your brand. James, you work across a lot of different verticals. When it comes to, say, sports, are the principles the same across? We've talked law enforcement, we've inferred political. Let's go way out of left field here. How does that work in sports when it seems like, to me as the outside person, people love sports, they're going to buy tickets regardless?
Yeah, I mean, they will buy tickets regardless. However, I will say, if you're looking to increase your value in your contract, I'm going to bet on people who are not a liability for my brand, right? Particularly, I think this is really critical in the age of name, image, and likeness, where you have athletes coming out of college. Typically speaking, the numbers say that men are a little riskier bet to put money behind. And one of the, a 20-year-old man doesn't always act with the same maturity that 20-year-old women do, right? And so what we've seen in the name, image, and likeness space is some of the naysayers before this happened, where college athletes were able to accept money and sponsorships and whatnot. They said it's only going to go to the people who are the best athletes. It's only going to go to men. And we've seen women take a lion's share of resources from it. We've also seen really great athletes lose those opportunities for endorsements early on. And that also sets them up for what they will likely get whenever they go to an NFL team, right? If you are too much of a liability, you will get cut from the team altogether. They can't take that either. They don't want that either. It comes down to not only will I go to the game, but will I buy this person's jersey? What does that look like?
So Jennifer Bocock has taught me the term the golden hour during a crisis. And so Christina asked here on LinkedIn, she said, when a crisis hits, the first breakdown is almost always communication. So Christopher, to answer her question, what does unpracticed communication actually cost a leadership team in those early moments? And how do you help the C-suite understand that rehearsal is the only way to prevent the breakdown before it happens?
Yeah, so what we say is that a communication failure in the first hour is a leadership failure by the sixth hour. If you're not communicating right out of the gate, it's not just a comms problem. It becomes a problem all the way at the top very soon. And it's not just about practicing, it's about having a plan in place. And too many organizations either don't have a plan or they have a plan that really doesn't guide them when a crisis strikes. Our CEO, Julie Parker, she was a former media personality in DC. And when she transitioned to be a media relations director for a large police department in DC, She had no idea how to run a police department media bureau, but what she decided she would do is run it like she ran the newsroom. And so that's kind of the philosophy we use, is that organizations should look at their comms as your own mini newsroom. You're telling your own story. You should have a plan in place. It should be rehearsed. And when the thing goes boom, the mechanism just activates and you're communicating. Because if you're trying to get the plan together, if you're trying to decide who has authorizations, who's writing the message, who's approving the message, all that takes so much time. And as we know, social media, it goes like that. So if there's not that plan in place and it's not rehearsed, it's going to be a communications failure that evolves to a leadership failure. And so often we see, especially in my world of law enforcement, a chief of police who him or herself did nothing wrong still end up losing their job because the failure to communicate was so poor when something really critical was happening.
One of the things, again, being on the outside, a political journalist, is I've appreciated how a lot of police departments rely on outside investigators immediately. That's the first thing to earn that trust, that we're not going to try to cover something up, and the cameras likewise. So, James, when it comes to earning that trust, I think that one thing we've hinted at but haven't outright said is partnerships within the community, because they could become, you've said, Lisa, for 20 years, but what kind of partnerships, Lisa, I'd like you to talk about this from a brand management perspective, is how do you use partnerships to create not just the trust with those individuals in their communities, but also because that synergy that you create over time is that when you issue the press release in good times, people believe you. And in tough times, they're also going to believe you because you have that support across your region or your industry through partnerships.
I'll tell you a little story about Dallas, Texas. Dallas, Texas was facing significant uptick in homicide a few years ago. They had gang rivalries there. It was making national news. The police chief there, Chief Garcia, he said, we've got to figure out how to solve this. So he went and started talking to a former gang leader who had spent some time in jail, who's running a nonprofit down there in Dallas called, his name is Anton Lucky, and he was running this nonprofit, which was a violence interrupter program. He started talking to them about, what do you see? What do you need? He started talking to another nonprofit in the area, a guy named Chad Hauser. He was running a youth interdiction program where they would intervene with kids who had gotten caught up in the juvenile system. And they had a restaurant where they were taking these kids and bringing them into the restaurant and showing them life skills like showing up on time, work ethic, how to be a part of a team, a career trajectory, how they could earn and be productive members of their family, and not only their family, of their community. So he brought all these people together, right? You have a police chief and a former gang leader. And the former gang leader locked the two gang rivals into a high school gym in Dallas, Texas, and brokered a standoff and said, we can't do this. So who is the trusted leaders in your community? Maybe people who have walked that path, a dangerous, bad, lonely path, who can say, you don't want to do this. I had to have a prison ministry to get me out of it, right? To see the light here. And you don't want to have to go through a prison ministry. Help me help you. And how do we bring this community together? And little by little, they started chipping away at the homicide incidents in Dallas, and they started going down. And it is a model for what I think public safety in a lot of communities could look like. Dallas has had its challenges for sure. But under the leadership of Chief Garcia, the incidents where you have homicides has gone down significantly. And I think that's a wonderful model of community partnership.
Dustin, I think another thing too that is really important, and Christopher probably talks about this quite a bit in his training, is that we have to remember who our allies are, right? So not only having a sense of who we are, but James just made a really good point there, and that is that where are our allies? Before the crisis hits, we need to think about who are the people that we're going to call. Who do we trust? And it's not just the media, but is there someone that your CEO is in connection with, that they talk to every day? I mean, do they have one of our friends like to calls him the Irish uncle, right? I mean, who is it that you call to ask good advice of? right? And as the communications person, having a sense of who it is, or your trusted, is it your lawyer? Is it your accountant? Who are the people that are in your cabinet of counsel that you would call on? Who are the first calls? Because what Chris says about a communication error in the first hour being the error that the CEO will own in the sixth can be very well anticipated by understanding who calls who and what the first moves are. And so not only knowing who you yourself are, but also knowing who your trusted allies are is a really important piece of thinking ahead before the crisis hits, and not, I'm sure, the moment that it hits, you start to think about. So that's another piece of advice that I always give is let's start to think about who are your trusted allies now, long before it gets to be a spicy time and you're communicating.
So my next question, James, I think it was James, you talked about, you might have local trust, but you'll have national voices now participating in what was a local law enforcement challenge. So Christopher, a couple of years back, so I wrote about this in the piece I mentioned earlier that Dave Trusnick inspired, where Southwest, in my opinion, handled the 2022 winter issue they had, where they had the outdated system, which was a failure of planning and technical components. But my friend of mine could do nothing more than praise them for how they handled it. He got his money back. They brought his back to the store. They gave him something to use later. But then another audience got involved called the federal government and give them a huge fine. Where do you think about advising the what are maybe not core stakeholders, but maybe one step away, like the federal government paying you a fine, even if your customers stay with you? How do you, when you think about law enforcement? Sure, the local community trusts you, but now you're on the national stage and you have all these people out of town, media, national voices, lawyers, etc., more involved. How do you keep the C-suite disciplined ahead of time to know who they should be in touch with and convincing and in the moment?
Yeah, well, part of developing a crisis communications plan is really drilling down into who is your audience. And so if your focus stays there, like we'll take the police department example, you may be in the national spotlight, but at the end of the day, who is your most important audience? Well, it's the people you serve, the people who live in your community, the people who visit there, the people who come in to work and to shop there. And so if you have maintained their trust, even if the rest of the country, the rest of the world is against you, really that's your core focus. And it's hard, it's very difficult when your social media feeds are filled with negative comments and the CEO or the chief of police is getting constant emails. It's difficult to maintain that focus on your audience. But I've been in situations where locally we had the trust. In a broader region, we were definitely looked at negatively. But it's about returning that focus to who's our core audience here. It's our stakeholders, it's our partners, it's the people we serve. And part of the comms team role is to not get caught up in the angst of being in the national spotlight. And there's a lot of stress. I don't think that people who aren't in communications understand the level of stress communicators are placed under when they're dealing with all the negativity they see day in and day out. But I would encourage those people, their role is to refocus. Who's your audience? Who are you trying to reach? And at the end of the day, if you're a police department in the middle of Wisconsin, do you really care what Becky in Topeka, Kansas thinks about you? We'd love to have her support, but at the end of the day, I care about the people that I'm serving in the community that I serve.
James, how do you? No, that's back. So James, when we talk about law enforcement, again, looking at the news only, right, not being involved in this space, there were a lot of ICE controversies last year, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and that was sort of tied into the larger law enforcement narrative of America's too strong of policing. How do you get ahead of those sort of narratives that can lump you in with a larger issue or crisis that may be happening, even though ICE and local law enforcement are in completely different spaces in terms of authorization, budget, control, and audiences? How do you get ahead of that type of lumping?
So there are a couple things that are happening here that I would point to. One is panic is contagious, but so is calm. And a good plan will allow you to act with calmness. Panic will create more crisis for you. It'll create the second crisis for you, right? You'll make a misstep. You'll put out something without checking with the right person, with the right authorities. Legal won't review something. Like there will be errors along the way, but if you have a plan, you can assess the situation without, and you can act with urgency, but without those unforced errors. That in and of itself comes from a team that is already doing the things that they're supposed to be doing. So if you're doing the things that you're supposed to be doing as law enforcement, in terms of communicating well with the community, and in terms of communicating well with the people you serve, then they're not going to conflate you with ICE in the other example, because you already are proactive about who you are, what you do, why you do it, and the people you do it for, right? So that conflation it's not as easily mistaken, I guess. There may be areas where you can still have to address and point out that, hey, that wasn't our jurisdiction. Here's what our jurisdiction is. And you can do that cleanly because you already have the apparatus to talk to the constituents. You already have those channels built in. Lisa mentioned you have your own media channels. You have your social media channels that you've invested in. You have all of the forums for the community events. So I don't see that as being a problem for a team that's doing a good job on the front end.
Yeah, one of the things we saw was we did have to help our clients with some education, because at the end of the day, there were plenty of people in communities who didn't understand the different roles and the different levels of authority and missions of the different agencies. But as James said, if they had channels, if they had communication already open with the community, it wasn't a huge lift to do that education. It was just having the right messaging, being clear about what it was you were educating people about, and pushing that message out. But oftentimes it will take some educating, because we saw even law enforcement wasn't exactly clear sometimes where the lines were drawn on who had what authority. So how could you expect the public to? So it really is important that we remember that oftentimes our audience doesn't know what we know. And we take that for granted. We do it day in and day out. And so part of crisis communications is communicating to your audience. It doesn't matter what you know if you can't communicate it in a way that they understand it. So it's remembering where they're at, what they know and don't know, or probably don't know, and making sure that you've made it as simple as possible to understand what are some very complicated issues.
So, Lisa, I'll throw the final question to you, and then we'll do a round robin after you answer. A few years back, I think it was the Delta Airlines issue in 2021. They were accused of supporting Jim Crow 2.0 out of Georgia. And I remember I think it was their CEO was just on all these talk shows. And I started to wonder, how much time, which in his case is his most valuable commodity, and how much money through that time is the company losing by being on defense and scrambling instead of just moving the ball forward on profit, on new business and other things. So my question to you, Lisa, speaking from the brand management perspective, is when someone says, "Oh, I don't want to invest in that, that's going to take a lot of time." How do you show them on the back end that CEO is going to be, that 6th hour is going to become a 60th hour and a 600th hour on their cost of their time and their energy?
I think the good news is that the interest in planning ahead is shifting. I think if nothing else, it really seems like more than ever before, corporate offices are recognizing how important this is. I've had more work, more training, more opportunities this year than I've ever had before to work with clients on this particular piece of work. And I think some of it has to do with the fact that it has become a noisier environment. There's so much more noise in the space. But the hopeful thing that I tell all of my clients is that the rapid pace of the news has actually allowed us a little more space to breathe, because we don't need to react as quickly as we once did, because in fact, it may not actually be as big an issue as it once could have been. So we need to be ready and we need to monitor, but we don't necessarily have to act as fast as we once did, because in fact, in 15 minutes, there might be another crisis that puts ours out of the front pages.
And doesn't mean you don't have to react to your core stakeholder, but it may mean the secondary and third level
That's right.
are not
But
as important.
maybe not
Hey,
necessarily.
how you doing?
Yeah. Yeah.
So we got about 3-4 minutes left. what haven't we talked about? James, Lisa, Christopher, what haven't we talked about that you think is really important for communications leaders to understand about convincing the C-suite this should be invested in long before the crisis hits?
I would say
One thing,
oh, sorry.
please go ahead, James.
I would say good counselors understand the functions of other departments. So I am consistently giving advice on government affairs, legal. I'm not a lawyer, by the way. Legal, policy, business operations, finance, so on and so forth. I am constantly throwing those things out there, not because I'm necessarily have all the answers, but I want to ensure that our clients, and I push this on our team, are thinking about comms as it interacts with every capability within the business. That's critical. And so the more you can learn what the objectives are, like legal says, we want to keep you out of trouble, right? We don't want to get you sued. So understanding that that's where they're trying to come from now helps you recalibrate your communication strategy to achieve your communications objectives while also achieving the legal objectives.
Yeah, what I would really stress is that, oftentimes I get the idea that leaders feel like they're too busy to deal with something that may happen in the future, crisis planning. But the reality is this. For our leaders, the day-to-day operations, while they're not unimportant, it's really the least valuable thing that a leader does. The chief of police, I could go on vacation for 2 weeks and the police department would still run fine in normal day-to-day operations. It was the crisis. It was leading through a pandemic. It was when we had an officer-involved shooting. It was when we had a mass shooting. That's when leadership was really important. So if you get so busy in the day-to-day, they're running the numbers, they're going to the meetings. I'm not saying those things don't matter, but they all fall by the wayside. When the event goes boom, prepare for it now, because that is where leadership shines. And I would argue that good crisis communications is not really defensive. It's actually offensive, because you're demonstrating your leadership and how prepared you were. So there is no better leadership than successfully leading through something that's really bad.
I think James makes a great point, and I think Christopher just emphasized it even more. Investing in your communications team now and letting them to have some room to run could also save you quite a bit of time on the back end. So making sure that you have the right people in place, thinking ahead of time, knowing that you have an infrastructure that can support you while you step away, or can support you when the rubber hits the road, I think is probably the best investment. And that's something, like I mentioned before, I think is very much a trend I'm seeing. And it's one that I think will continue to grow. Communicators are absolutely at the table. They're on the C-suite. They're in the room. And that's quite a bit different from when we all got started in our business.
Well, I don't want to date myself too much, but I only got started a few years ago. So, no, this was great. Again, I apologize for being so late. We're on a family vacation, so the internet wasn't quite what I hoped it would be in the car. But I am going to have to jump. So, Christopher, it was a pleasure to meet you. Sorry for a little bit of a negative first impression on the first 15 minutes. James, Lisa, as always, good to see you again. And thanks, everybody. This was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it. Have a good rest of your day. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.